Oh, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Impact and Coffee this morning on Tuesday, June 16th. I cannot believe we're already at mid-June already. Today we have a special conversation on arts in our community. And I think we have to pivot a little bit today because one of our guests, Shel Sanchez, had to unfortunately take care of some other things. If you haven't heard, last night was a protest was interrupted violently by a militia group, a white supremacist group down here in Old Town, and they shot a protester. And so that person is in critical condition. Hopefully, we're hoping for that person's safe recovery tonight. But I also want folks to know that the shooter was Stephen Baca, a North Valley resident and someone who ran for city council last year for District 2. And so this is something that's been happening for the last couple of weeks where white supremacist militia groups show up to peaceful protests and intimidate the protesters. This is how white supremacy shows up in our community. It's here, it's alive and well, and I need y'all to know and figure out a way that we can fight it together. So I'm Robert Nelson. I'm the program manager for Pivotal New Mexico. Welcome again this morning. My co-host, as always, is the wonderful Mariah Harrison. Hi, Mariah. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
And like I said before, we have a special guest. Her name is Gabriela Baez over at the Urban Enhancement Trust Fund. We are waiting for Lee Francis. We hope he shows this morning, but unfortunately, Shel Sanchez will not be able to join us. So it is Gratitude Tuesday, Mariah. Is there anything you're grateful for today?
I'm grateful for capable doctors and supportive family members right now. My inner circle is really supportive right now, and I need that. So how about you?
I'm grateful for community members who continue to stand up for what's right every single day. So for those of you who are new to Impact and Coffee is a welcoming conversation to build community with the nonprofit sector. I see a lot of very familiar faces on the phone today. Welcome. I see a lot of unfamiliar faces. Welcome too. Just a reminder that this is being recorded and that this will be released probably within a day. And it will be released on our email newsletter, which usually comes out at the end of the week, and on social media. Please like us on Facebook. It's facebook.com/Impact and Coffee. You can check in at the event too, and maybe even share a screenshot. That's possible as well. And if you are, since we have just one guest today, we're going to try to keep it conversational. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat. You're all on mute still. And what we'll do is if you put a question in the chat, we'll try to lift that up to Gabriela as best as possible. So I think without further ado, I think we can go ahead and introduce Gabriela Baez, a neighbor and a friend of mine. I used to work at Working Classrooms, but I'll let her introduce herself fully.
Thank you, Robert and Mariah. So good morning, everyone. I'm Gabriela Baez. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, downtown actually, and have been part of a practice that some of you may have experienced called Indigenous Land Acknowledgement. So want to acknowledge the traditional ancestors and present-day inhabitants of the land I live on, the Tiwa people, as well as I know people are calling from all over New Mexico. So the 23 sovereign nations and the 19 pueblos are a part of that. And also want to acknowledge that Indigenous Americans are still here, over 220,000 Native Americans in New Mexico today. And forgive me, I am a little, what's the word? I guess shaken up is the best description. We were at the prayer vigil last night. And it's both a hopeful reminder of like what is possible in reckoning with structures of white supremacy and oppression of people of color, that there's going to be a shift in our world soon, but it's also very hard and very scary to see the violent reactions towards people trying to assert truth and healing in their lives and in all of our lives because it impacts us all. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I was, as Robert mentioned, the former executive director of Working Classroom, which is a 30-ish year old arts and social justice organization that primarily works with youth and artists of color to create original theater, public art installations, and new media projects, many of which focus on social and environmental justice. So if you've ever driven around downtown Albuquerque, many of the public art projects and murals were working classroom projects. I think the important thing to highlight about my work there and my upbringing there, I was a student there from the time I was 11 till I was 18, is that every art project Working Classroom engaged in dialogue around justice, whether it be environmental justice, social justice. So that was always integral to what we did and what we believed art had the power to do. I then went to college out of state and lived in New York City for a while and worked at a culturally specific institution called the Studio Museum in Harlem. So it's the predominant museum for contemporary Black and African American art and art of the African diaspora in New York City. And so came up around some really brilliant thinkers around, again, what contemporary art has the power to do, shift hearts and minds, and bring up issues around social justice and racial justice. Worked under Thelma Golden, and then moved back to work at Working Classroom again. I've since transitioned from being Working Classroom's executive director 2 years ago. For a while, worked with the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, doing national organizing work around ideas that support organizations much like Working Classroom around the nation, as well as more mainstream institutions who are trying to use their platform as cultural institutions to create social and environmental change in the world. I am no longer with USDAC, but I still do a lot of work around the arts. I actually work more in philanthropy now, and I can maybe go into why I made that decision later. Art and culture and access to it is still very much at the center of why I do the work I do. But I guess today I'm here in many roles with all my experience, and specifically my role as the chairperson of the Urban Enhancement Trust Fund Committee, which is part of the City of Albuquerque's Cultural Services Department. So I sit on a committee of appointed representatives who decide how we designate Urban Enhancement Trust Fund dollars to support arts and culture, specifically performance events, gatherings around the city of Albuquerque. So last year we gave, I believe, a little over $300,000 to arts organizations and fiscally sponsored projects around the city. And then about a month ago, we allocated about $300,000 in relief funding for arts organizations and projects around Albuquerque in response to the pandemic. I became chair of the committee. So I joined the committee a year ago and I became chair in February. And the whole reason I joined the committee was because I really believed in this mayor's administration and their shift towards centering equity and inclusion in their work. And that's really where I am holding my leadership as the chairperson of this committee, is how do we look at the inequities that have existed in public funding for the arts throughout time, and what do we do to change that? And how do we do that in a way that centers the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but that also builds bridges between communities, white communities, wealthy communities, poor communities. So that's, I think, primarily the hat I'm wearing today, and I'll bring the other hats with me as well.
Thank you, Gabriela. This is going to be there's just so much richness that comes from your background and what we'd love to hear from you today. So feel free to expand on any of these questions that we ask. The first one that we always ask everybody these days is a little bit more in relation to the situation with COVID. And we know that it's been challenging, and I think that you've had a lot of direct connection with the organizations that have been affected. So, you know, you can speak from Urban Enhancement or you can speak from any of your other work, but what challenges has your organization or your work been faced with in the last 3 months?
So that's an interesting question, because I think there are 2 points that I can kind of make, or 2 paths I can take. So the first is Urban Enhancement Trust Fund, right? Typically funds events or gatherings that have been in person. The New Mexico Folk Festival, right? In-person music event. The Southwest Opera, in-person event. Mariachi Spectacular, in-person event. Casa Barelas gatherings in the Barelas community. None of those are going to meet our social distancing or physical distancing requirements anytime soon. And so I think one of the challenges is, how do we make sure the people who are employed by these, what is our responsibility in ensuring that the people who are employed by or have livelihoods connected to this work don't suffer from further economic damage because they're not being paid for their work? And how do we also understand that not everything translates to digital implementation? And what does that mean? And so, and then also, like, what are we asking these organizations or even, you know, fiscally sponsored projects to do? Like, how heavy of a lift is that in a moment that is just so hard to try to shift digitally? So I think there's a lot of questions of, like, what does the work look like now? And how do we stretch what we typically fund or what the requirements of the ordinance are to still meet, like, the legal implications of what Urban Enhancement Trust Fund money is supposed to be, right? Events or future events. But how do we also understand this is a really strange moment in which not everything is going to translate to, you know, a Zoom platform necessarily. And I think making new discoveries about all the legal implications of, like, intellectual property rights, if someone's proposing something and broadcasting it, and then we're sponsored, like, I think there are just new implications for what is possible for this funding. The second path is a racial equity and inclusion path. For me, we've all probably seen the news reports about how this pandemic is disproportionately affecting Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And the thing that is just so hard about that in terms of the arts is that the organizations led by and serving communities of color have always struggled to get their equal share of funding, and have always been very close to shutting their doors. I, at Working Classroom, you know, ran a relatively well-resourced organization, and it was always difficult to keep our doors open compared to seeing some of the dollars that the bigger mainstream Eurocentric institutions were getting. And so I think this moment is also just highlighting the inequities in funding for the arts, and how do we step into a place of understanding, if we have a limited amount of dollars, how do we reach out to the communities that are most impacted the first and serve them in a way so that they will survive, because many of these institutions also don't have wealthy patrons.
All incredible good points that we would like to have separate conversations about too. I appreciate the vision about the 2 different paths, and they absolutely align and intersect. So I'm going to turn it over to Robert to ask our second question. And again, if anybody here in the audience, the Zoom audience, has questions, please utilize the chat.
Thanks, Mariah, and thanks, Gabrielle. I think there's you were starting to segue into this question a little bit. So, how is your organization partner with other groups to address some of these challenges? You know, it is hard to do virtual art affairs, virtual art exhibits. So, could you just share, like, you know, how people have been able to overcome some of those? And a second kind of part or compound part of this question is, like, do you have any suggestions for people or other organizations or businesses looking to partner with the Urban Enhancement Trust Fund?
If I'm not answering the question, let me know, because I'm trying to hold them both in my head. So the first one is, so like what I've seen some folks use this opportunity to do the work that gets ignored, which is also important work, which is like archive work, right? So how do we use this moment to take our past work and figure out how to put it on a digital platform that is accessible, and then advertise the community as a resource? Some of us, and it's inspiration from the Allied Media Conference, have been talking about, like, how is this moment a chrysalis moment for organizations? And so, like, I know at Working Classroom, when did we ever have time to go through the archives and share that work of 30 years of history? And so I think in some ways, if organizations that do events and arts and culture see it as a moment to pivot to do the work that they usually don't have the time to do, it's actually really useful. And then really exploring, like, what accessibility means for this moment. You know, there's often limitations to who can attend events because of cost, or maybe people with different abilities who can't get to the actual events for whatever reasons. And so I also see organization and groups engaging in platforms that could increase accessibility for everyone post-pandemic. I'm trying to think of what was your second question, Robert? I'm sorry.
Just any suggestions you might have for any people or organizations just looking to partner with the trust fund? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest thing was with this relief funding, you know, it was so great to have this little rainy day fund that $300,000 actually makes a huge impact in the arts community in Albuquerque. You know, so often frustrated, right? The two layers. Arts is always this neglected piece of city budgets and of state budgets. And anytime I would ask elected officials about, you know, arts funding, they could never answer the question because it's always so teeny, teeny, tiny. So like $300,000 was huge for the arts community in general. And then the other layer of, like, you look at that tiny sliver of arts funding, and then who's getting the tiniest piece? It's low-income communities, low-wealth communities, and communities of color. And so I'm just curious about, like, in terms of, like, policy and advocacy, right? Partnership is, how do we become advocates for the arts in general, for everybody, to increase that piece of the pie that we're getting budget-wise, right, from public dollars that serve us all. But could you imagine if we doubled it, what that would mean? And then how we also become co-conspirators in making sure, you know, a more significant piece of that budget goes to grassroots institutions and institutions led by and serving people of color. The other piece I would say is just, and I think we already do a pretty good job of it, but to figure out if you are a business owner, or if you do work that can engage artists to be paid in the work, to commission artists as part of whatever business plan you have, to paint murals, design logos, create digital campaigns. So yeah, I think it's also just a more conscious investment in engaging artists in every level of your work, which I'm sure much of this group already does.
Thanks for that. And you mentioned a very important part of, you know, I like to call it budget justice because I'm a nerd. You're right. We just don't. We make a moral statement by saying we don't fund art in the way that it should, and even just artists of color, communities of color in general. So thank you for lifting that up. Mariah, do you want to ask the next question?
So I think that, I mean, you touched on this a little bit, coming from the unique position that you have at a funding-based organization. And I've learned a lot about the Urban Enhancement Trust Fund lately that maybe you could expand on, is the background on where the money comes from and why it happens every year, and how this unique piece came from the relief also. So, and the question is around funding and whether or not your organization applied for funding federally or for assistance. And so if that's not the case with some of your direct work right now, or if you do have experience working with artists or supporting artists that have been looking for funding, we're interested in information about that. And then also, as a funder, I think you guys are setting a really incredible example for how funders can be responsive to community needs. And so if you can talk about that perspective of being in a place of setting an example for organizations that are listening a little bit more than they're telling people what to do with money. So the big question is about, you know, the concept of funding and relief support around the COVID experience for artists and the creative economy overall.
Okay, so I'm like, oof, that's a lot. So Urban Enhancement Trust Fund is a public endowment that was created by the City Council in 1983 to fund urban design and cultural projects. And our funding happens on a 2-year cycle. That means, it's interesting, the rapid response felt so different than our normal process, because the normal process is like, looks so far in advance, right? We grant dollars and put out the application a year before people are even going to get the money in their bank accounts. And the rapid response funding was very different. So I have a lot of curiosity around like what that means for our ability to do more responsive work in general in the future. So going back to what we do, it's a 2-year cycle. I've been part of one general process, and then in years past, I was part of an organization, Working Classroom, that applied for and received the funding. So I've been through the process on both ends. So 2-year cycle, a committee of 11 people, I believe 11, I'm kind of blanking right now. 1 representative per district, and then 2 at-large members. And we make recommendations to City Council in terms of how this budget is to be spent. The projects fund dance, music, theater, literature, and history. And I think we've also been really pushing the envelope to understand how more contemporary forms of art fit into these categories. So organizations apply for the grant, the committee reviews it, and makes recommendations to the City Council and the mayor, and then they get approved. I get, again, given, I think, around $300,000 to $400,000 every 2 years. And the reason we had this $300,000 to give as relief was from really thoughtful and prudent foresight on part of City of Albuquerque staff. What we were told was that in years past, the decision to not spend every single dollar was made each cycle. And so we were saving that money for a rainy day that in February, we had no idea we would be spending it in, May. And so that's where we are with the funding. What was the other question, Mariah? I'm sorry.
So, have you been working with artists to look for federal funding for COVID relief outside of the board and the perspective coming from an organization that does a little more listening than they do describing to an organization how they should use their funding?
That's a really interesting question. So in terms of the federal dollars, I have not done any direct work. But I think the conversations that are happening are like, who has the ability and the capacity to access federal dollars, and then how are they equitably distributing them, and what limitations has policy put on how they can do that. I'm not going to name any organizations, but there are some like regional arts organizations that received money through the CARES Act. And they are typically an organization that's really good at figuring out how grassroots organizations and organizations led by people of color who are very typically have lower capacity to be able to do the rapid, like, let's do this a bazillion page grant application and get it in tomorrow, right? One thing I noticed about their process was it was first come, first serve. And I have not investigated, but I'm really curious about like what limitations the policy for how these federal dollars were supposed to go out changed how they were able to respond. So I think it's more complicated than, you know, so often like an organization just being able to do what they believe and want because of the restrictions tied to like mandate, federal mandate or state mandate. You know, I mean, it's not necessarily directly related to the present moment, but I've always had questions about like our state's anti-donation clause and what that limits in terms of our ability to really resource nonprofits in sustainable ways. And so I think this moment is also a learning for where money comes from and what strings it has attached to it change what we're able to do. In terms of foundations, like private foundations and private philanthropy, I've been very impressed with how some of the foundations, I think they were already doing it, right? They were doing more listening than telling or trying to pivot in that direction. And I've seen them move more quickly into that direction, and there's still work to be done. So as hard as this moment is, I really have hope that it's going to allow us to like, for those who have the ability to direct funding or to create the mechanisms from which that funding gets distributed, to really reevaluate and change how we're doing it, because we're realizing it isn't working for everybody, or it hasn't worked for everybody for a long time. Oh, one more thing. Fiscally sponsored projects. The Urban Enhancement Trust Fund was doing it before, and I think we're iterating on it. We were already going to iterate on it again this year, and we will, I think, be even more thoughtful about it because of COVID. But I'm really happy that we figured out how to support fiscally sponsored projects, which I think really supports artists at the grassroots level because they don't need their 501c3 to apply. So that actually happened before I was even on the committee. And I think there's definitely work to be done around how to actually make it more intentionally equitable. But the baseline theory is brilliant and actually very simple, that you don't need a 501c3 to apply to get this funding. You just need a relationship with a fiscal sponsor so that the city both meets its requirements, you know, of due diligence according to what the ordinance says, and we're not leaving folks out who don't have the ability to create their own nonprofit.
I appreciate that point a lot, because it's not just large organizations or 501c3s that are contributing to our creative economy here in Albuquerque. There's a lot of smaller individuals that just need a little bit of support to get by, and like you were saying, making a livelihood. So good point. Robert, I'll pass it on to you for the next one.
Sure. Actually, I want to kind of back up a little bit. You mentioned the anti-donation clause. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I know it's a barrier for a lot of nonprofits around our city, especially and around our state. And so, could you just and for those who aren't familiar with it, could you talk about it so that we have some background for it too?
Feel free to jump in too, because you're what did you say? A budget justice policy geek. I can tell a story about it. So here's the story I'll tell. About 8 years ago now, when I was the visual art program director at Working Classroom, we were doing a public art project that we received pass-through money from the state to do public art, came through the city. The city was, you know, helping us work through our budget and everything. And there were other sources of funding too, right? because it was you know, a few tens of thousands of dollars project. We were at the beginning of building Working Classroom's new media program. And, you know, again, reiterate, we're working at Working Classroom with primarily youth of color, youth from communities that have experienced historic disenfranchisement. And, you know, oftentimes their schools don't have access to technology. So we were really trying hard to build up the technology in our youth arts program so that they could do new media. For this project, we needed to buy a pretty basic DSLR camera to do some of the work. And so we purchased the DSLR and used it for the project. And at the end of the project, I don't know, this is maybe too harsh a word, but I'm going to use it. The camera got seized because I put it in the wrong budget line. I designated it as part of public dollars, right? The city/state funding. If I would have designated it to, say, the private foundation funding, I could have kept it. And, you know, a little bit of frustration around, like, why didn't we work together to figure out the budget so that it wouldn't get taken away? But for me, the problem with the anti-donation clause related to that story is nonprofits can never build up the things they need to continue to do their work. So it just leads to, like, lack of sustainability. In our case, it was like we couldn't use the money on anything that would help us continue to support our students through new media, but we could spend it on, you know, guest artist fees. And feel free to chime in, Robert. It was always, I learned from that hurdle and was better about shuffling my budgets. But it's just like, why make us do those extra, you know, gymnastics when we could be spending the time to do the work?
I think we see that in foundations almost every single day. I know Aaron and Tara are on the call. You know, we as nonprofits, we have to jump through hoops, especially when it comes to any sort of funding that's granted or contracted, either from a government agency or even a private foundation. So I know some funders are being a little bit more lax on reporting, which is nice. You know, Hank Hughes was on the call last week, and we talked about a foundation that said, you guys don't have to do reports this year. And he said, oh my gosh. Or no, it was, they basically gave them their grant for next year, which saved him so much time from writing a new grant, having to sweat out, you know, having to search for a new grant or anything like that, or having to do the rest of the dance just to apply for that money that kind of feels like it should be a guarantee, but isn't. And so that highlights, like, year-to-year funding rather than multi-year investments too. So our city does yearly contracts, if I'm correct on that front, and so does the Urban Enhancement Trust Fund. And so that could be one of those things that a city could look at for nonprofit organizations, because like I know organizations that do events and that use trust fund money, and it's like a one-time thing, and then you have to reapply, and then the reporting is really can be a little much for a volunteer-led organization. And so that's the other hoop that people have to jump through as well.
Yeah. The one thing I will say that is actually an anomaly for Urban Enhancement Trust Fund is, I think our reporting right now is enough to be, like, due diligence on terms of, like, spending public dollars, but not so much that it's cumbersome or prohibitive to the institutions applying for the money. I think the one big question I have right now is maybe how do we include a little more demographic data to really see where our public dollars are going, because that's not something we currently collect. But I think that there's curiosity around, like, how do we really understand how public dollars are being spent, that balance, right? How do we have enough data to understand where the money's going, but we don't want to burden the organizations or grassroots projects. So I think we've been really good about not requiring too much reporting, and have curiosities around, like, maybe there's a tiny bit more that will help us understand how we're spending our money.
Absolutely. I'll jump to the next question, and you highlighted a little bit of this. So I think in a lot of ways, you know, when we talk about art, especially around artists of color, you know, we don't see a lot of the hiring of artists of color. We don't necessarily see lifting up of, like, galleries of color in that way, or even just like projects for that. And so could you talk about like a little bit more, expound a little bit more from your earlier point about how our community can change some of these inequities? How can we participate more in lifting up, how we can be more equitable, how we can be more just around the arts community?
And I have little kiddos in the background right now, so if you hear the noise, that's them. Okay, so that's like, you're like asking the question that is like forming and guiding my life's purpose right now. And so I think I referred to this idea of like the shift in my work from purely focused on the arts to focusing more on philanthropy and economic justice. I think one of the issues I was running up against with this idea of arts as a special interest, right? Arts as a piece of the budget that's always very teeny tiny, and also usually people of color are left out of it. I was asking the question of like, what does that mean? Who's defining art? Who's defining culture? How is culture, supported? How do we make meaning? And one of the conclusions I came to is if culture is a human right? If I believe that culture is a human right, how do communities have the ability to practice it on their own terms? And to me, that meant we have to support the conditions that make culture possible for people outside of institutions. So I'll give an example in New Mexico. An example of our cultural heritage in New Mexico, to me, could be the Pueblo feast days. And so if you've ever been to a feast day, like imagine what goes into making that feast day possible, right? There are grandmas and aunties sewing ribbon skirts. There are people making food. There are folks taking time off work to be in community and practice their dances together and be in ceremony together. Those are things you cannot fund through traditional arts and culture umbrellas. There's no way to have metrics or reports. And like, it's absurd to think that any of the Pueblos would apply for funding, to make ribbon skirts and make feast day possible, or to pass on these cultural traditions, right? Language. And so the thing I started thinking about is, I think like combating wealth inequality, and making like dignified lives, health, housing. If all of those things are taken care of, then culture that exists outside of institutions, especially for communities of color who don't even see themselves under the art and culture umbrella, like that makes culture and community more possible. So that's like, it's interesting because it can't exist within the framework of how do we support arts and culture for communities of color. I think if we want to support arts and culture for communities of color, we just have to support communities and communities of color in having their basic needs met, which make it possible to be in community and practice culture. Under the umbrella of arts and culture as a special interest group, I think it's just, advocate for more funding for arts and culture in general. Really see and understand how mainstream institutions are resourced and how they're spending that money. I think we need to continue to push and challenge them to be more diverse and inclusive in who's on their boards, who's in leadership positions on their staff. Many institutions will have people connected to low-income communities or communities of color in their education staff, but none of the executive leadership comes from those communities. So I think we need to continue to grow and push and challenge within those mainstream institutions. And we need to not always look to those institutions to be the ones who get the funding to resource those communities. We need to figure out how we be more inclusive for the grassroots communities to practice and lead their own arts and culture events and initiatives. And I think they're, like I said, very simple things that we're already doing or already know that make that possible. The fiscal sponsorship change to the Urban Enhancement Trust Funds project was like one easy one, right? Why not? Fiscal sponsor projects, that makes it more possible for folks who don't have their 501c3 to apply. And how do we continue to iterate and grow with the things that are actually simple fixes while making the structural and institutional changes?
Thank you so much for bringing that up. And also bringing it back to the trust fund too. I think you highlighted something that I know as someone who's Filipino American, it's hard to find funding for our cultural events as Filipinos here in New Mexico, especially. And so we don't make up a huge part of the population, and just thinking about how easy it could be to be responsive to other cultural assets. I mean, just thinking about decolonizing our capital in a lot of ways. And for those of you on the call, like read Decolonizing Wealth by Edward Villanueva. He has family here in New Mexico, and he's a really great writer, formerly at the Novo Foundation. Just tremendous book, tremendous stuff. Just kind of along this vein, is there any anything we could substantively advocate for, any policy wise, that we could start to work on this kind of reinvestment into arts and culture? I know, I've been here on this platform saying defund the police. I'm a firm believer that once you start to defund our militaristic structures and start to put into community services, cultural services, then we'll start to see a wider, richer community. And that means really looking at cultural development in a much different fashion.
I mean, I think that there have been ideas that are proposed before. I wish Shell and Sherry were here to share some of their stories, but yeah, I think it's shift in budgets, right? So what happens when we defund the police, and where does that money go? And how do we make sure artists, culture bearers, creatives are at the table when that money is being divvied up? And also, Sherry has this story about how I think we were advocating for maybe 10 or 15 years ago, a point something percent increase on the 1% for the arts tax, something teeny tiny. But if 1% is our budget, what does 2% mean? And so yeah, what tax policies support more intentional investment in the arts? And yeah, I think it's also a culture shift. How do we understand it's not a special interest issue area or policy area? And yesterday, for example, what happened with the Oñate statue, right? Culture is at the center of it. Symbols are at the center of it. How do we invest in the people, artists and creatives and culture bearers who are making meaning of our world, and do that in an intentional way where, through public dollars? So I don't have a concrete answer. I think there are a lot of policy prototypes out there. If people want to geek out on policy, I would say look at WESTAF, the work WESTAF is doing, which is the Western States Arts Federation. They support regional advocacy for the 13 Western states. And they also do national advocacy work with Americans for the Arts. So, trips to DC to ask for the significant, but also measly, I'm going to be real, 148, I think, million is the average that comes to the National Endowment for the Arts every year, which we always see, the current administration using as a tactic to say, I'm going to defund the arts when it's such a teeny tiny part of the budget, right? And for the NEA, I think it was increased to 150 some million, and that feels like a big win. But I think we need to fight harder for the things that actually make us human and make life meaningful, and arts and culture is a part of that.
Thanks for that. I appreciate it. I also just imagine what that extra 1% could actually be.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man. I'm going to kick it over to Mariah to ask our very last question, and we can take a lot of time with it. We can also take any questions from the audience afterwards too. So Mariah, take us along.
Well, you really made a big point about some specifics that we all can be more cognizant about and what we can be paying attention to. And I'll give you the last word here because we do have you used your time wisely. I'll tell you what, we didn't necessarily need several people on this panel to do so much information, and you're incredible at your job. So I want to point out two things, is that while we were putting this panel together, we were thinking about kind of what Albuquerque as a whole is experiencing in the creative economy, what's new, and how are organizations changing and pivoting, how are individuals pivoting to get their art seen. And what are arts groups doing to support that? And so I want to point out also that we've seen something new with the art walk. Last week, there was drive up, pick up, and bike up, and there were still organizations downtown doing some really great work to support our local artists. And then there's also the new digital platform, Enhancement TV, where you can watch artists live and then bid on their work. And that's a different example too of pivoting to the digital, even though not everybody has access to that, but you can also pay people directly, and that's kind of cool. So based on the work that you're seeing with the fund and your overall philosophy, if you could just expand on the question that we ask everybody at the end, and this is not just for funders, organizations, but everyday people and people in our audience today, is what can our community do for you today? How can people help from home? And then moving forward, what are creative ways that people can help nonprofits or artists and art communities? So that big picture of what we can do individually to help you today.
I'll start with the individual. So if you have the means financially to support artists, whether it's to just donate to them, because I know that, there are some different lists floating around of, right now, specifically the list I'm thinking of, the Santa Fe based list, but Black artists and entertainers in Santa Fe, and it has all of their Venmo information. So there's a push to say, like, a lot of these artists are out of work right now. Let's throw some money in their hat and show them some love just because. So I think there's, the ability to give directly to artists who've made our community rich since forever and show them some love and gratitude in this hard moment with no expectation of goods exchanged or strings attached on the individual level. And I think there's also, I said, I still have a job. I got a what is it called? What were they called? The checks we got in the mail. The relief assistance from the federal government, right? I got one, and I still have a job, and I know lots of undocumented artists who are out of work right now, who weren't gonna be funded, and many of them who are part of my circles were saying, I'm wanting to be commissioned for work, and so commissioned an artist to paint a portrait of someone in my life as a gift to someone else in my life, and paid them what they asked, no haggling or bargaining. And so I think, how can you commission artists to do work if work is something they're wanting right now? And then in terms of the shift to how we do the work, art walks and stuff is, I think it was New Mexico Community Capital. I don't know if you're familiar with how they shifted supporting some of their arts entrepreneurs to selling their arts online, Native American entrepreneurs. And so I think there are a lot of organizations that are building up infrastructure to support traditional artists and cultural bearers, especially Native artists, because, we know that people aren't able to sell stuff in Old Town or on the plaza in Santa Fe anymore. And so not just supporting the artist directly through going to those websites and supporting them individually, but like figure out the organizations that are needing to build up their infrastructure right now in order to give artists those platforms through technology.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. So that's our last formal question, and we've seen a little bit of activity in the chat. So if you have resources you want to add there, but you still can, you can still add some questions. So we'll probably give a couple minutes for that. And then also, of course, if you have any Gratitude Tuesday or if you have any general community announcements, you're welcome to use that. So I'm going to leave it to Gabby to add anything else that you might want to share that you think is poignant right now. And Robert, if you have anything else, I'll let you wrap us up.
No, just gratitude for the platform and just the reminder, and I think everyone knows this, but that it happens at every level, right? Individual, community, structural, cultural. And so just, I know I'm doing the work to better understand how I do the work across all of those areas when I'm in positions of power or even just within my own community and relationships. So inviting an exploration of those things in your life too.
Thanks, Gabrielle. We do have a question from the chat. What was the Black artist support list through Venmo? Oriana, thank you so much for lifting up that question.
I can grab it off of Facebook and drop it in the chat. It's, I'm pretty sure it's only Santa Fe based artists, but we'll see when I drop it in the chat.
Thanks, Gabrielle. And thanks for that, Oriana, too. There was another comment too. Please consider donating to the Native American Relief Fund. Thank you for that, for putting that up there as well. That is it for Impact and Coffee today. We are going to let everyone reclaim their time with about 7.5 minutes left for their Tuesdays, which is a great feeling, knowing how busy everyone is. But know that this is our last Impact and Coffee. Actually, it's not our last Impact and Coffee for June. We're actually planning a very special Impact and Coffee for June 30th to talk about racial justice specifically. And so please keep an eye out for some more information on our Facebook about that event. We're planning it out right now as we speak. But our next one will be June 30th, and then we'll go in with our regular July programming on July 7th. We want to just a great big thank you to Gabrielle today for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing everything and lifting up your truth and a lot of our community's truth as well. Big thanks to our Impact and Coffee team, Mariah, Michael, Aaron, Destiny, Jamie, and Juan. They make this possible the first 3 weeks of the month, and it's always a blast just to be with them every single time, every single week. And thank you to everyone, especially for joining us this morning. It was a really great conversation. I know it's a lot more conversational than we're used to, but I think conversation is great. So it's really amazing to be part of this community with all of you. So I'm very grateful for all of y'all. Like I said before, check out the recording. It'll come out on Facebook and YouTube later, either later today or tomorrow. Thanks for dropping that in the chat, Gabrielle. That's gonna be awesome. And I think that's it. Mariah, is there anything else before we close out today?
No, I don't think so. I think I would encourage everybody to take a moment of gratitude or silence or breathing today, whatever that means, and hone in on your center to appreciate where you're at with your life right now and each other. That's my suggestion.
Awesome. Thanks, Mariah. And thanks again to everybody for being at Impact and Coffee. We'll see you on June 30th. Have a really great Tuesday. Have a really great week. And may all your lights be green. Thanks and take care.